The security badge made a soft beep as it was deactivated. 7:45 a.m., Tuesday morning. I was standing in HR Director Patricia Caldwell's sterile office, still holding my coffee, watching her fingers move across her computer with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this before. Many times before. Your access has been revoked, effective immediately, she said without looking up from her screen. Security will escort you to collect personal items only. Nothing proprietary leaves this building. I set my coffee down on her desk, the ceramic mug making a deliberate clink against the glass surface. Patricia, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake building in my chest, this is a mistake. The Morrison deal closes Thursday. The Japanese portfolio review is tomorrow. You can't seriously think. This decision comes from the highest level, she interrupted, finally meeting my eyes. There was something there, a flicker of what might have been regret or perhaps just professional discomfort. The company is restructuring the intellectual property division. Your role has been determined to be redundant. Redundant. The word sat in the air like a toxic cloud. 12 years of building Techmark Global's patent portfolio from 47 scattered applications to a fortress of over 3,200 worldwide registrations. 12 years of turning legal protection into competitive advantage, of transforming defensive strategies into revenue streams worth hundreds of millions. Redundant. I suppose Martin Ashford will be taking over my responsibilities, I said. It wasn't really a question. We both knew VP Ashford's nephew had been circling my position since his hire 6 months ago. Fresh out of law school, zero IP experience, but blessed with the right last name and an MBA from Daddy's alma mater. Transition details will be handled appropriately, Patricia replied, which was corporate speak for yes, the completely unqualified nepotism hire will be inheriting everything you built. 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. I recognized them both, Marcus and Jenny, professionals I'd shared morning pleasantries with for years. Neither could meet my eyes now. The walk through the office was choreographed humiliation. Past the bullpen where junior associates pretended to study their screens while tracking my progress with peripheral vision. Past the conference rooms where I'd negotiated million-dollar licensing deals and defended patent challenges that could have cost the company everything. Past my corner office with its view of downtown Seattle, where the walls were lined with framed certificates representing intellectual property victories that had shaped entire market segments. My personal items fit into a single banker's box. Family photos, a small succulent that had survived 3 office relocations, my grandfather's fountain pen, and a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be routine legal documents, but was actually my insurance policy. The USB drive was already in my purse, containing files that Patricia and her security theater couldn't touch because they belonged to me, not to Techmark Global, to me. Miss Chen, Marcus said quietly as we approached the elevators, I'm sorry about this. You've always been straight with us. I managed a smile. Just doing your job, Marcus, I understand. But I did understand more than that. I understood that in their rush to clear the deck for nepotism, they'd made the kind of mistake that destroys companies. They'd assumed that intellectual property was just paperwork, that patents were simply documents filed and forgotten. They had no idea that the foundation of their entire global operation was built on a structure I'd created 3 years ago, a structure designed specifically to protect against exactly this kind of corporate betrayal. The elevator descended toward the lobby, and with each floor, I felt the weight of what was about to unfold. Techmark Global's leadership thought they'd solved a political problem by removing me. Instead, they'd activated a dead man's switch that would bring their empire to its knees. The lobby was busy with the usual Tuesday morning traffic. Employees hurrying in with their coffee and determination, visitors waiting for appointments, the perpetual motion of corporate ambition. I walked through it all carrying my small box of personal effects, looking for all the world like another casualty of restructuring. No one could see the quiet satisfaction building in my chest. My name is Victoria Chen, and for 12 years I served as Senior Vice President of Global Intellectual Property at Techmark Global, building one of the most sophisticated patent portfolios in the technology sector. This morning, they discarded me like obsolete equipment. By lunchtime, they would discover that some equipment is load-bearing. The parking garage was dimly lit, concrete and steel echoing with the soft hum of ventilation systems. I placed my box in the passenger seat of my Audi, then pulled out my phone. 3 missed calls from my team, probably already hearing rumors. I ignored them for now and dialed a different number. Thomas Mitchell answered on the first ring. Victoria, I was wondering when you'd call. His voice carried the satisfaction of a lawyer who'd been proven right about a contingency plan he'd hoped would never be necessary. They pulled the trigger this morning, I said, starting my car and driving toward the exit. 7:45 a.m. termination, security escort, the full humiliation package, and Martin Ashford's nephew will presumably be taking over my responsibilities, though I doubt he understands what those responsibilities actually entail. Thomas chuckled. I don't imagine he does. Shall we proceed with the Prometheus Protocol? The Prometheus Protocol. We'd named it 3 years ago when I first suspected that Martin Ashford's growing influence might eventually target my position. The legal structure was elegant in its simplicity, a web of licensing agreements and subsidiary relationships that gave me control over the intellectual property I'd developed while employed at Techmark, without violating any employment contracts or confidentiality agreements. Yes, I said, merging into downtown Seattle traffic. Initiate Phase 1. The beauty of the Prometheus Protocol lay not in its complexity, but in its transparency. Every arrangement was documented, filed, and completely legal. I'd simply been more thorough than anyone realized in protecting my work and Techmark's interests. The problem was that Techmark's interests and Techmark leadership's interests weren't always aligned. I pulled into the parking garage of the Columbia Tower, where Thomas Mitchell's firm occupied 3 floors of legal excellence. My heels clicked against the concrete as I walked toward the elevator, the sound echoing like a countdown timer. In my purse, my phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from colleagues who were starting to understand that something significant had happened. Thomas was waiting in his office, a silver-haired veteran of intellectual property warfare who'd helped me structure protections that were about to prove their worth. The documents spread across his conference table represented 3 years of careful preparation. The subsidiary structure is clean, he said as I sat down across from him. Chen Innovations LLC owns the patents, Techmark holds the licensing agreement, contingent on certain employment provisions. When those provisions were violated this morning, the licensing terms shifted automatically. I nodded, reviewing the paperwork that would reshape everything. To what terms? Exclusive licensing converts to non-exclusive, revocable at will. More importantly, all sublicensing agreements require renegotiation. That includes the 17 international partnerships, the joint ventures with Samsung and Huawei, and the entire Morrison Technologies deal. The Morrison deal: $870 million in intellectual property licensing, technology transfer, and joint development agreements. The cornerstone of Techmark's projected growth for the next 5 years. A deal that hinged on patent rights that Techmark no longer exclusively controlled. How long until they realize what's happened? I asked. Thomas glanced at his watch. I'd estimate around 10:30 a.m., when Morrison's legal team tries to finalize the subsidiary licensing documentation. They'll discover that the required approvals can no longer be granted by Techmark alone. I smiled for the first time since sitting in Patricia Caldwell's office. And at that point, Victoria, you'll hold more leverage over Techmark Global than their entire board of directors combined. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Robert Fitzgerald, Techmark's chief legal counsel. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message. Victoria, we need to discuss the transition protocols for your departure. There are some licensing questions that require clarification. Please call me immediately. The panic in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. It was 8:47 a.m. They were beginning to understand that firing me had consequences beyond hurt feelings and unemployment benefits. Thomas leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the unfolding drama. What's your endgame here, Victoria? Full reinstatement, compensation, public humiliation for Martin Ashford. I considered the question while watching Seattle's skyline through his floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere in that maze of glass and steel, Techmark's executives were probably in emergency meetings, trying to understand how their simple personnel decision had become a corporate crisis. Justice, I said finally. 12 years of excellence dismissed for political convenience. They made this choice without considering the consequences. Now they'll live with those consequences. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Victoria, this is Derek Ashford. Uncle Martin says there's been a misunderstanding. Can we talk, Derek? Derek Ashford? The nepotism hire himself, probably just now learning that inheriting my position meant inheriting responsibilities he couldn't possibly understand. I showed the message to Thomas, who shook his head in amazement. They're sending the nephew to negotiate, he said. Either they don't understand the scope of this problem or they're more desperate than I thought. I typed back a simple response. All communications regarding intellectual property matters should go through my legal counsel, Thomas Mitchell, Mitchell and Associates. Then I blocked the number. By 9:15 a.m., my phone had collected 6 missed calls from various Techmark executives. I ignored them all and focused on the paperwork Thomas had prepared. Notification letters to 17 international partners, formal notice of licensing term changes, documentation that would need to be filed with the patent office. The machinery of legal protection grinding into motion. The first real explosion came at 9:38 a.m. Martin Ashford himself called, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Victoria, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "I'm protecting intellectual property rights that were developed under my supervision," I replied calmly, "all within the legal frameworks established during my employment. You can't hold the company hostage because you're upset about personnel decisions. I'm not holding anyone hostage, Martin. I'm simply ensuring that intellectual property licensing agreements are properly administered according to their terms. If that creates challenges for ongoing business operations, perhaps those operations should have been structured more carefully." The silence on his end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from anger to something approaching negotiation. "What do you want?" "I want Techmark Global to succeed," I said, and I meant it. "I want the intellectual property I helped develop to be used responsibly and profitably. I want decisions about patents and licensing to be made by people who understand their implications. So come back, we'll discuss terms." The offer hung between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross first. Coming back would mean working under the same leadership that had just humiliated me, pretending that trust hadn't been shattered, accepting that my years of loyalty meant nothing when weighed against political convenience. "I'll consider it," I lied, "but first you'll need to address the immediate licensing crisis. The Morrison deal can't proceed under current terms. We'll fix it." "How? Your new IP director has been on the job for 6 months. Does he understand the Japanese patent classifications? Can he navigate the Korean technology transfer requirements? Has he ever negotiated with Morrison's legal team?" Another long silence. We both knew the answers. "I'll expect a formal proposal by end of business today," I said. "All communications should go through Thomas Mitchell. And Martin, the next time you want to fire someone for political reasons, you might want to understand what they actually do first." I ended the call and looked at Thomas, who was grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. That, he said, was beautiful, absolutely beautiful, but we were just getting started. At 10:15 a.m., my phone lit up with a call from Morrison Technologies CEO, James Morrison himself. I answered immediately. "Victoria, thank God. I've been trying to reach someone at Techmark all morning. Our legal team is telling me there's some kind of problem with the licensing documentation. I'm no longer with Techmark as of this morning, Mr. Morrison. Any questions about the licensing structure should be directed to Derek Ashford, who's taken over intellectual property matters." There was a pause. "Derek Ashford? The kid they just hired?" "Victoria, he called me an hour ago asking what a technology transfer agreement was." My heart sank and soared simultaneously. Derek's incompetence was validating my warnings while potentially destroying relationships I'd spent years building. "Mr. Morrison," I said carefully, "I can't comment on Techmark's internal decisions. However, if you have questions about the patents underlying your licensing agreement, I might be able to provide some clarity. As the inventor listed on most of those patents, I have certain rights and responsibilities." Another pause, longer this time. "Victoria, are you telling me that Techmark fired the person who actually controls the patents they're trying to license to us? The patents are owned by Chen Innovations LLC, which has been licensing them exclusively to Techmark. That licensing arrangement has recently become more flexible." I could hear him talking to someone in the background, probably his legal team. When he came back on the line, his voice was sharp with understanding. "How flexible?" "That would depend on the terms any new licensee might be willing to accept. We need to talk, in person, today." I glanced at Thomas, who nodded approvingly. "I'd be happy to meet with you, Mr. Morrison. Though I should mention that Techmark's board might not appreciate their former employees negotiating directly with their clients. Let me worry about Techmark's board. Can you be in Vancouver by 2 p.m.? Vancouver. Morrison's headquarters, where the largest technology transfer deal in Techmark's history was supposed to be finalized. Where Derek Ashford was probably sitting in meetings he couldn't possibly understand, making commitments he had no authority to make. "I'll be there," I said. As I hung up, Thomas was already pulling up flight schedules on his laptop. "There's a 12:30 p.m. flight to Vancouver. Private terminal, we can have you there in plenty of time." I stood and gathered my purse, feeling the weight of the USB drive that contained years of patent documentation, licensing histories, and technical specifications that Derek Ashford didn't even know existed. "Thomas," I said, touching his shoulder as I prepared to leave, "when they call you and they will call you, remember that this isn't about revenge. This is about responsibility." He smiled. "Of course not. This is about intellectual property rights being properly administered by qualified professionals." By 11 a.m., I was in the air above the Pacific Northwest, watching the landscape shrink beneath me while my former employer probably descended into full crisis mode. My phone, set to airplane mode, held 17 unread messages and 12 missed calls. They would have to wait. Morrison Technologies occupied a gleaming complex overlooking Vancouver's harbor, all glass and steel reaching toward mountain peaks that made Seattle's skyline look modest by comparison. James Morrison himself met me in the lobby, a gesture that spoke volumes about how seriously he was taking this situation. "Victoria," he said, shaking my hand with the firm grip of a man accustomed to high-stakes negotiations, "I appreciate you coming on such short notice. We have a lot to discuss." He led me to a conference room where 3 of his senior executives waited, along with 2 lawyers who looked like they'd been pulled from other meetings. Tablets and laptops covered the table, displaying patent documents and licensing agreements that represented months of careful negotiation. "Let me cut to the chase," Morrison said as we sat down. "Derek Ashford spent 2 hours in this room this morning trying to explain licensing terms he clearly doesn't understand. My legal team is telling me that the patents we're trying to license might not be controlled by Techmark at all. What exactly is going on?" I opened my portfolio and spread out the documents Thomas had prepared. "The patents underlying your technology transfer agreement were developed by me during my employment at Techmark Global. Under the legal structure we established, Chen Innovations LLC owns the intellectual property, with Techmark holding exclusive licensing rights contingent on certain employment conditions. And those conditions were violated when Techmark terminated my employment this morning without proper transition protocols." Morrison leaned forward, studying the patent assignments and subsidiary agreements. "So you're telling me that Techmark fired the person who actually owns the technology they're trying to sell us? The situation is more complex than that, but essentially, yes. Techmark can no longer provide the exclusive licensing terms outlined in your agreement." One of Morrison's lawyers, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Chen, looked up from her laptop. "I've been reviewing the patent filings. Dr. Chen is listed as primary inventor on 43 of the 47 patents covered by our agreement. The subsidiary structure appears to be completely legal." Morrison turned to his chief technology officer, who'd been quietly reviewing technical specifications. "Mike, what's your assessment?" "The technology is solid," Mike replied. "Some of the most innovative work I've seen in distributed processing architecture. But if we can't get stable licensing terms—" "You can," I said, "just not necessarily from Techmark." The room fell silent except for the hum of climate control and the distant sound of harbor traffic. Morrison studied me across the table, clearly calculating the implications of what I was proposing. "You're suggesting we license directly from Chen Innovations? I'm suggesting that might provide more stability than dealing with a company that fires its intellectual property experts for political reasons." Sarah Chen was already taking notes. "What would direct licensing terms look like? More favorable than what Techmark was offering," I said. "Chen Innovations doesn't have shareholders demanding maximum extraction from every agreement. We're more interested in long-term partnerships than short-term revenue spikes." Morrison's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and showed me the screen. "Martin Ashford calling." He declined the call. "Victoria," he said, "I've known Martin Ashford for 15 years. We've done 3 major deals together. But if his company fires the person who actually created what they're selling, that raises serious questions about their judgment and stability." I nodded. "Those are exactly the questions you should be asking." Over the next hour, we outlined preliminary terms for a direct licensing agreement between Morrison Technologies and Chen Innovations LLC. The financial terms were actually better for Morrison than what Techmark had proposed, while still being more profitable for me than the subsidiary royalties I'd been receiving. Morrison's lawyers would need time to review the documentation, but the framework was solid. More importantly, Morrison was gaining confidence that his technology partnership would be managed by someone who actually understood the underlying innovations. As we concluded the meeting, Morrison walked me back toward the lobby. "Victoria," he said, "I have to ask, is this really just about proper intellectual property management, or is there an element of payback here?" I considered the question while watching Vancouver's harbor through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere across that water, Techmark's executives were probably in emergency sessions, trying to understand how their simple personnel decision had become an existential crisis. "Mr. Morrison," I said, 12 years ago I began developing the intellectual property that made this deal possible. Every patent application, every technical innovation, every licensing strategy that brought us to this point came from work I supervised. This morning, Techmark decided that work could be transferred to someone with 6 months of experience and a convenient last name. So it is about payback. It's about competence," I corrected. "The same competence that created the technology you want a license. Would you rather do business with the person who built it or the person who inherited it through nepotism? Morrison smiled. When you put it that way, the choice seems obvious. By 4 p.m., I was back in Seattle, but the day was far from over. Thomas met me at the airport with updates that made my afternoon in Vancouver look like a preliminary skirmish. The Morrison situation was just the beginning, he said as we drove back toward downtown. Chen Innovations LLC holds patents that underlie 17 different international licensing agreements. Every one of them requires renegotiation now that the exclusive licensing terms have changed. What's the total value? Combined, we're looking at intellectual property licensing worth approximately $870 million annually. And that's just the direct licensing. The joint ventures and subsidiary partnerships add another $300 million in potential revenue. I felt the full weight of that number. 12 years of work, reduced to the political convenience of clearing a path for nepotism, now representing over $1 billion in annual business relationships. How is Techmark responding? Panic, mostly. Martin Ashford called 6 times. Their board called an emergency meeting for 6 p.m. Robert Fitzgerald has been trying to reach me all afternoon, probably to explore settlement options. And Derek Ashford? Thomas laughed. Derek Ashford, according to my sources, spent most of the afternoon trying to understand what a technology transfer agreement actually involves. Apparently, he asked someone in the legal department if patents expire every year like car registrations. Despite everything, I had to smile at that. The gap between his confidence and competence was exactly what I'd warned Martin Ashford about 6 months ago when Derek first joined the company. My phone rang as we pulled into Thomas's parking garage. Martin Ashford again. This time I answered. Victoria, his voice was strained, barely holding together. We need to resolve this situation immediately. The board is demanding answers. The situation was resolved this morning when you terminated my employment, I replied. What you're dealing with now are the consequences of that decision. Don't play games with me. You're sabotaging the company. I'm protecting intellectual property rights. The fact that this creates problems for Techmark suggests their business model was built on assumptions rather than actual ownership. There was a long pause. When Martin spoke again, his voice had shifted to something approaching desperation. What do you want? Full reinstatement, department head position, salary increase, board seat. The offers tumbled out like cards from a desperate gambler's hand. 6 months ago, any of those concessions would have addressed my concerns about Derek's appointment. This morning, they would have prevented this entire crisis. Now they felt like trying to stop an avalanche with an umbrella. Martin, I said, this morning you had a senior vice president with 12 years of experience managing a billion-dollar intellectual property portfolio. Tonight you have a nepotism hire who doesn't understand the difference between a patent and a trademark. Those consequences aren't negotiable, but we can fix this. Bring you back, give Derek a different position, restructure the department. Can you fix the Morrison deal? Can you restore confidence among 17 international partners who have spent the day discovering that their licensing agreements are managed by someone who doesn't understand them? Another long silence. I'll make this simple, I continued. Chen Innovations LLC is now accepting licensing applications for intellectual property previously managed exclusively through Techmark Global. Applications will be reviewed based on technical merit, partnership potential, and management competence. You're putting us out of business. I'm opening the market to competition. If Techmark can demonstrate that they're the best partner for licensing these technologies, they'll continue to benefit from them. If they can't, I let the sentence hang there like a blade. After I ended the call, Thomas and I went over the logistics of what would happen next. Legal notifications to international partners, licensing applications from companies that had been waiting years for access to technologies Techmark had controlled exclusively, media management as the story inevitably broke. The intellectual property world was small and gossipy. By tomorrow morning, everyone would know that Techmark Global had fired their IP chief and lost control of patents worth nearly $1 billion in annual licensing revenue. The ripple effects would spread through technology markets like seismic waves. My phone buzzed with a text message from Derek Ashford. Victoria, I know I screwed up today. Uncle Martin is furious. Can you help me understand what I'm supposed to be doing? I'm in over my head. For a moment, I felt something almost like sympathy. Derek hadn't asked to be thrown into deep water without swimming lessons. He was a victim of his uncle's arrogance as much as I was. But sympathy wouldn't restore confidence in licensing agreements or repair relationships damaged by incompetence. I forwarded the message to Thomas without responding. Derek Ashford would have to learn the same way everyone else did, through experience and consequences. The difference was that his learning curve was now playing out in $100 million licensing deals. By 6 p.m., I was home in my Capitol Hill apartment, glass of wine in hand, watching the sun set over Elliott Bay while my former employer held emergency board meetings to address a crisis of their own making. The irony wasn't lost on me. This morning, I'd been escorted from their building like a security risk. Tonight, I controlled the intellectual property foundation their entire business was built on. My phone had finally stopped ringing. 18 missed calls from various Techmark executives, 43 unread emails, and 6 voicemail messages that I would probably never listen to. They'd had 12 years to treat me as a valued colleague. They'd chosen to treat me as disposable. Now they would live with that choice. The next morning brought confirmation that the crisis had deepened overnight. Thomas called at 7 a.m. with updates that made yesterday's chaos look like the opening act. Samsung called off their joint venture, he said without preamble. Apparently, Derek Ashford told their licensing team that technology transfer agreements were basically like equipment leases. They've decided to explore direct licensing through Chen Innovations. I sat up in bed, fully awake now. Samsung was a $40 million annual partnership. Huawei followed 2 hours later, Thomas continued. Same story. Derek tried to explain patent pooling arrangements and somehow convinced them that Techmark was planning to withdraw from international markets. That was another $60 million annually. Morrison called this morning to confirm the direct licensing agreement. Their lawyers worked through the night to restructure the deal. They're eager to announce the partnership. I walked to my kitchen and started coffee while Thomas recounted the overnight developments. In less than 18 hours, Martin Ashford's political decision had cost Techmark over $100 million in annual licensing revenue. Derek's incompetence was accelerating the damage beyond anything I could have planned. What's their stock price? I asked, down 12% in after-hours trading. The markets are starting to understand what happened. By 8 a.m., I was dressed and heading downtown for meetings with potential new licensing partners. Companies that had been waiting years for access to technologies Techmark had controlled exclusively were suddenly eager to negotiate. The market that had been closed was now wide open. Morrison Technologies was first, finalizing the direct licensing agreement that would give them more favorable terms while providing Chen Innovations with more revenue than the Techmark subsidiary arrangement ever had. James Morrison signed the documents with obvious satisfaction. "This is how intellectual property licensing should work," he said as we concluded. Direct relationship with the actual innovator, transparent terms, long-term partnership focus. The second meeting was with Apex Industries, a company that had been trying to license distributed processing patents through Techmark for 18 months. Their CEO, Linda Park, didn't bother with small talk. "We've been watching this situation develop since yesterday," she said. "Techmark's handling of the licensing process has been frustrating. They act like gatekeepers rather than facilitators. Chen Innovations operates differently," I explained. "We're more interested in seeing the technology used effectively than in maximizing fees for gatekeeping services." The third meeting was with Dynamic Systems, whose CTO had worked with me years earlier and remembered the technical depth I brought to licensing discussions. "Victoria," he said, shaking his head in amazement, "I can't believe Techmark let you go. Working with them without you was like trying to license patents from people who'd never read them." That perspective was becoming common. Technology companies wanted to license innovations from people who actually understood them, not from bureaucrats who treated patents like commodities. By noon, I had signed 3 new direct licensing agreements worth a combined $130 million annually. Chen Innovations LLC had gone from a protective legal structure to an active intellectual property licensing company in less than 24 hours. Thomas called with the latest update from Techmark. "They're hemorrhaging partnerships faster than they can schedule damage control meetings. Derek Ashford has been removed from client contact, but the damage is done. Companies are discovering they can get better terms and more knowledgeable service by licensing directly from you." "What about Martin Ashford? He's called me 6 times this morning. Each time the offers get more desperate. They're willing to give you complete autonomy, unlimited budget, equity participation, even a board seat." "Too late," I said. "The market has spoken." That afternoon brought news that completed Techmark's transformation from my former employer to a cautionary tale about corporate arrogance. Their largest client, integrated circuits manufacturer Meridian Tech, announced they were terminating their licensing agreement and negotiating directly with Chen Innovations. The Meridian relationship represented $240 million in annual licensing revenue. It had taken me 3 years to develop, based on deep technical discussions and careful attention to their specific manufacturing requirements. Derek Ashford had managed to destroy it in 2 days by suggesting that semiconductor patents were basically software licenses. Meridian's CTO called me personally. Victoria, we've worked together for 3 years. You understand our challenges, our technical requirements, our development roadmap. We want to continue that relationship, but not through intermediaries who don't understand what they're managing. By 5 p.m., Chen Innovations LLC had signed 6 major licensing agreements representing over $400 million in annual revenue. Techmark Global had lost approximately 60% of their intellectual property licensing business in 48 hours. The technology press had picked up the story by evening. TechCrunch ran a headline, "Patent Portfolio Disaster, How Techmark Lost $400 million by Firing Their IP Chief." The article quoted anonymous sources describing Derek Ashford's incompetent handling of major licensing relationships and Martin Ashford's political decision to prioritize nepotism over expertise. The Wall Street Journal was more analytical, focusing on the business implications. Intellectual property licensing shakeup demonstrates risk of inadequate succession planning. Their analysis noted that Techmark's stock had dropped 18%, while companies licensing directly from Chen Innovations were gaining market confidence. My phone rang at 7 p.m. Robert Fitzgerald, Techmark's chief legal counsel. "Victoria," he said, his voice heavy with defeat, "I need to ask directly. What would it take for you to restore the exclusive licensing arrangements?" I considered the question while looking out at Seattle's evening skyline. Techmark Global was still visible from my apartment, though their offices were dark despite the late hour. Emergency board meetings had probably moved to different locations. "Robert," I said, "the exclusive licensing arrangements were terminated when Techmark violated the employment conditions that supported them. Chen Innovations is now operating as an independent licensing entity. But theoretically, could new exclusive arrangements be negotiated? Theoretically, any licensing arrangement could be negotiated. But exclusivity would require guarantees of competent management, stable employment for qualified personnel, and terms that reflected the market value of unrestricted access to these technologies." "What kind of terms?" I named a number that made him gasp. "Victoria, that's more than Techmark's entire intellectual property budget. Then perhaps Techmark should focus on developing their own intellectual property rather than licensing technologies developed by people they've fired." After I ended the call, I poured another glass of wine and reflected on how completely the situation had reversed. Wednesday morning, I'd been unemployed and humiliated. Thursday evening, I was running an intellectual property licensing company with $400 million in annual contracts and companies lining up for access to technologies they'd never been able to license before. Martin Ashford had thought he could solve a political problem by removing me. Instead, he'd created an existential crisis for his entire company while launching my independent business career. Friday morning brought the final confirmation that Techmark's crisis had become permanent. The Korean Technology Consortium, representing 17 companies across multiple industries, announced they were withdrawing from negotiations with Techmark and seeking direct licensing agreements with Chen Innovations. The Korean deal had been Martin Ashford's pet project, a complex arrangement worth $300 million that he'd personally negotiated over 18 months. Derek Ashford had managed to destroy it in 3 days by confusing technology transfer requirements with import regulations. Thomas met me at my apartment with the updated business summary. Chen Innovations LLC now held licensing agreements worth $700 million annually. Techmark Global's intellectual property division had lost approximately 80% of its revenue in 5 days. Their stock is down 31%, Thomas reported. The board called another emergency meeting for this afternoon. Martin Ashford may not survive the week. What about Derek? Derek Ashford was quietly reassigned to business development yesterday. Apparently, he asked someone in legal whether patents had to be renewed every year like driver's licenses. I almost felt sorry for Derek. Almost. But his incompetence had accelerated consequences that were always inevitable once Martin decided that politics mattered more than competence. My phone rang. James Morrison. "Victoria," he said, his voice bright with satisfaction, "I wanted to thank you personally. Our direct licensing agreement has exceeded every expectation. My technical team is getting better support from Chen Innovations in 1 week than they got from Techmark in 2 years." "I appreciate that feedback, Mr. Morrison. Chen Innovations focuses on partnership rather than gatekeeping. I've been talking to other CEOs about our experience. Several are interested in exploring similar arrangements. I'm always happy to discuss potential partnerships." By noon, I had 3 more licensing inquiries from companies Morrison had recommended. The intellectual property market that Techmark had controlled through bureaucratic gatekeeping was discovering that direct relationships with innovators provided better terms and more responsive service. Saturday morning, 1 week after HR canceled my badge, I woke up to a news alert that completed the transformation. Techmark Global Board removes CEO Martin Ashford following intellectual property crisis. The article detailed how a simple personnel decision had triggered the loss of nearly $1 billion in annual licensing revenue. Derek Ashford, the article noted, had been quietly transferred to a training position within the company's business development department. Sources close to the board suggested that his brief tenure managing intellectual property had become a case study in the dangers of nepotism in technical positions. I read the article over coffee in my home office, which had become the unofficial headquarters of Chen Innovations LLC. The irony was perfect. Martin Ashford had fired me to clear a path for his nephew's advancement. Instead, he destroyed his own career while launching mine. Thomas called at 9 a.m. with the final tally. Chen Innovations now held licensing agreements worth $820 million annually. Techmark Global's intellectual property division, once valued at over $1 billion, was being restructured as a subsidiary business unit. Their new interim CEO wants to meet with you, Thomas reported. Apparently, they're exploring the possibility of Chen Innovations acquiring Techmark's remaining patent portfolio, the student becoming the teacher, the former employee buying out the former employer. The symmetry was almost too perfect. What did you tell them? That Chen Innovations might consider such an acquisition, but only if the terms reflected the current market value of intellectual property managed by competent professionals. Monday morning, exactly 1 week after my termination, I walked back into Techmark Global's building. Not as an escorted former employee, but as CEO of an independent intellectual property licensing company being courted by their interim leadership. The same security guards who'd walked me out were now checking me in as a VIP visitor. Marcus smiled as he handed me a guest badge. "Good to see you back, Miss Chen," he said quietly. "Things haven't been the same around here." I took the elevator to the executive floor, where Patricia Caldwell from HR was waiting. Her professional demeanor couldn't quite hide the discomfort of greeting someone she'd terminated just days earlier. "Miss Chen," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for coming. The executive team is eager to discuss potential collaboration opportunities." The conference room where they'd once held my intellectual property presentations had been reconfigured for what was essentially a surrender negotiation. Techmark's interim CEO, board members, and remaining legal counsel sat across from me and Thomas like defeated generals discussing terms. "Dr. Chen," the interim CEO began, "I want to acknowledge that Techmark made serious errors in judgment regarding your termination and the transition of intellectual property responsibilities." I nodded but said nothing. Acknowledgement was a start, but it didn't address the fundamental problem of competence versus politics. We're prepared to discuss comprehensive arrangements that would restore stability to our intellectual property licensing relationships. "What kind of arrangements?" I asked. The proposal they presented was remarkable in its scope. Chen Innovations would acquire Techmark's remaining patent portfolio, assume management of their existing licensing relationships, and provide intellectual property services under a long-term contract. Essentially, they wanted to outsource their entire IP function to the person they'd fired for political convenience. The financial terms were generous, reflecting their desperation. But more importantly, the arrangement would give me complete autonomy over intellectual property strategy, licensing negotiations, and personnel decisions. "There is one condition," I said after reviewing the proposal. "Name it." "Derek Ashford cannot be involved in any intellectual property matters. His incompetence cost both companies hundreds of millions of dollars in damaged relationships." The interim CEO nodded immediately. "Derek has been permanently reassigned to business development activities that don't involve technical licensing." As we finalized the agreement, I thought about the journey from Tuesday morning's humiliation to Monday afternoon's vindication. 1 week had transformed me from a terminated employee to the owner of intellectual property assets worth over $1 billion. The signing ceremony was held in the same conference room where I'd once presented licensing strategies to executives who ultimately decided I was disposable. Now those same executives were signing documents that made me their intellectual property provider rather than their employee. As I walked out of Techmark's building for the second time, I carried a very different briefcase. Instead of personal effects, it contained ownership documents for patent portfolios, licensing agreements, and business relationships that represented the culmination of 12 years of professional dedication. Thomas met me at the elevator bank, grinning like a lottery winner. "Congratulations," he said. "You've just completed one of the most elegant corporate reversals I've ever witnessed." We walked through the lobby together, past the security desk where Marcus gave me a subtle thumbs up, past the directory where Chen Innovations LLC would soon be listed as a tenant, past the revolving doors that had seemed so final just 1 week earlier. Outside, Seattle's afternoon light caught the glass facades of downtown buildings, each one potentially housing companies that might benefit from intellectual property licensing arrangements managed by professionals who actually understood them. My phone buzzed with a message from Morrison Technologies. The preliminary results from our licensing partnership had exceeded all projections. They wanted to expand the relationship to include joint development projects. Another message came from Samsung, confirming that their direct licensing agreement with Chen Innovations had been approved by their board. The Korean Technology Consortium had scheduled a signing ceremony for the following week. By evening, I was back in my apartment, looking out at the city where everything had changed in 7 days. Techmark Global was still visible in the skyline, though their role had shifted from employer to client. They would continue operating, but under terms that prioritized competence over politics. My mother called just as I was preparing dinner. "I saw the news about your former company," she said, pride evident in her voice. "Something about their CEO being fired and you starting your own business?" "Something like that," I replied. "It turns out that firing people who understand your business can have unintended consequences." She laughed. "Your father always said that competence has a way of asserting itself, even when incompetence is in charge." Dad had been an engineer too, someone who understood that technical excellence couldn't be faked or inherited through family connections. He would have appreciated the symmetry of this week's events. 2 months later, Chen Innovations LLC occupied 3 floors of a downtown Seattle office building, employing 15 intellectual property professionals and managing licensing agreements worth over $1 billion annually. We had become exactly what I'd envisioned during those long nights when Martin Ashford's political maneuvering threatened everything I'd built. Derek Ashford, according to industry gossip, had left Techmark Global to pursue an MBA program focused on business development. His brief experience with intellectual property management had apparently convinced him that technical licensing required actual expertise. Martin Ashford had disappeared from the technology industry entirely. LinkedIn showed him as an independent business consultant, but no recent activity or client testimonials. Patricia Caldwell had survived Techmark's restructuring and actually reached out to apologize for her role in my termination. She'd recognized, too late, that personnel decisions driven by politics rather than performance had consequences beyond individual careers. The technology press had turned my story into a cautionary tale about corporate governance and succession planning. Harvard Business School had requested permission to develop a case study about intellectual property management and the risks of undervaluing technical expertise. But the most satisfying vindication came from the work itself. Chen Innovations was developing licensing partnerships that advanced technological innovation while providing fair terms for all parties. We weren't gatekeepers extracting maximum fees from necessary relationships. We were facilitators helping innovative companies access the intellectual property they needed to succeed. 1 year after HR canceled my badge at 7:45 a.m., I stood in Chen Innovations' conference room preparing for our annual board meeting. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Techmark Global's building, where they now operated as a client rather than my former employer. The annual report Thomas had prepared told the story in numbers that exceeded my most optimistic projections. Chen Innovations had grown from a defensive legal structure to a billion-dollar intellectual property licensing company in 12 months. We had proven that competence, properly supported, could build something more valuable than what politics had tried to destroy. My phone buzzed with a text from James Morrison. The joint development project we'd launched was ahead of schedule and under budget. His technical team had described working with Chen Innovations as the gold standard for intellectual property partnerships. Another message came from Linda Park at Apex Industries. Their licensing arrangement had enabled them to accelerate product development by 18 months, creating market advantages worth hundreds of millions in revenue. But the message that meant the most came from one of my former colleagues at Techmark, now working as a licensing coordinator for Chen Innovations. She'd followed me not because of financial incentives, but because she wanted to work in an environment where technical competence was valued over political connections. "Victoria," her message read, "thank you for showing us that there was an alternative to accepting incompetent management. What you built here is what Techmark should have been all along." As I prepared for the board meeting, I reflected on the transformation that had begun with a deactivated security badge and ended with professional vindication. Martin Ashford had thought he could solve a political problem by removing me. Instead, he'd revealed the difference between people who understand value and people who merely inherit positions. The board meeting itself was a celebration of strategic success and principled business practices. We'd proven that intellectual property licensing could be both profitable and ethical, that innovation could be protected without being hoarded, that competence could triumph over politics when given the opportunity. Chen Innovations LLC had become more than a business. It had become proof that when organizations prioritize politics over performance, they create opportunities for their former employees to build something better. They fired me at 7:45 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, thinking they'd solved a personnel problem. By 8:30, their entire intellectual property strategy was in crisis. Within a week, I controlled patents worth $870 million. Within a year, I'd built what they should have been all along, a company where competence mattered more than connections. Martin Ashford had taught me that loyalty without reciprocity is just exploitation waiting to happen. Derek Ashford had proven that inheritance without competence is just failure with